So Leonora Carrington in Mexico. This talk, it's not only about the time she spent there, but about how Mexico influenced her painting. That's not only her painting, her art in general, because she's not only a painter, she worked also with sculpture, with tapestries, she wrote theater plays, she was involved in cinema as well. So she was multifaceted as an artist, but she has seldom been criticized for being in Mexico and not really painting a Mexican subject, as we will see in some other artists like Diego Rivera. But the reason is because for Leonora, the impact of the Mexican culture and Mexico as a place, as a whole country, is much more profound. And it has to do with many different reasons that I will try to explain here while we look at the works. And the subtitle, The Mirror of the Marvelous, that is the title of the book by Dr. Pierre Mabille, who was a surrealist. He was very close to André Breton and to Leonora. And he actually convinced her to write down her memories from a time she spent in a psychiatric asylum to do it as a cathartic event. And he was somebody she really trusted. But in this book that was really important for Leonora, what he did was he collected myths and legends and fairy tales and stories from many different civilizations that all had to do with magic and with the marvelous, or this fantastic supernatural world that we can find in all the ancient civilizations. So that was something that really impacted Leonora since she was a child and throughout her life. This painting, Crookie Hall, represents the house where she grew up. Leonora was born in Lancaster, in England, in 1917. So 2 years ago, she would have turned 100. And her father was, at the time, one of the wealthiest men in England. He made a fortune with the chemicals and textile industry. And they bought this very big house in the region that was called Crookie Hall. It was an Edwardian house and mansion. She had horses. And this is to show you sort of the environment where she grew up, where she was constantly hearing all these fairy tales about ghosts, about giantess. If you can see here, this giant woman, almost the size of the house, and all the ghosts. She loved to read the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, but also the fairy tales, Alice in Wonderland. So since she was very little, she had an influence of all this magical world. And also her nanny and her mother, who were Irish, they will tell her from a very early age all these stories of the fairies, of the Shide, who were these mythical white people that were supposed to live under the earth and come out and show themselves. So all this world was very familiar to her since she was a little girl, and that we will see in her work throughout all her life. Many of her paintings have as a source a myth, a fairy tale, or any story from literature. So this is her when she was about 11, and one of the first notebooks that she kept and we were able to find, she was already designing these fantastic animals that we will see as a constant in all of her work. She was creating this island called Moskoski, and she had what's very interesting is, as a child, she already had an ecological consciousness. She was worried about what was going to happen to the planet. And she was writing about this new island that she was building as a paradise for animals to live when they were exterminated by humans. So that's something that makes her work very appealing even today. And that's why the young people also are very attracted to her painting, because she was a feminist and an ecologist of avant-garde. So she was ahead of her times in all these concepts and ideas that she will bring into her paintings. So she wanted to be an artist since she was very little, and her father wanted her to marry into royalty. They were very rich, but they were new rich, and they were not well accepted in the British society unless there was a marriage with somebody from the royalty. So the family presented Leonora to the court of the king when she was 15 years old to try to find her a suitable husband. And she brought with herself a book by Aldous Huxley, and so she retired to the garden to read under a tree, and she was refusing to be put up in a market, in a husband market there. And her mother was much more liberal and open and tried to support her, but the father was completely against a career in the arts. For him, that was for gypsies, and that was not proper for a girl from the high society. And on her birthday, when she was almost 20, her mother gifted her with a book. And the book was called Surrealism. And in the book, there was this painting that we see by Max Ernst, the German surrealist painter that was had almost the age of her father. And her mother finally convinced the father to allow her to travel to London and study at the Academy of Amadeus Enfant. So she went there, and that was her farewell present, the gift. And she fell in love with that painting. When she saw it, she said immediately for her, it was, she recognized that. She could resonate with that kind of work. And once she arrives in London, she's invited to see Max Ernst's first solo exhibition. And they fell in love immediately, and she ran away with him, which was a scandal. At the time he was married, so he left the wife and he ran away with Leonora. The father was trying to cancel his exhibition, saying that it was completely indecent, but he couldn't do it, and they decided to go to France before the father returned her home. So that's how Leonora got involved with the surrealism. Through Max Ernst, she met Breton, and she met the rest of the group. And she stayed with him barely 3 to 4 months in Paris when Max Ernst's wife showed up. And during one of these cafe meetings of the Surrealists, and she hit Leonora, and Leonora just hit her back and told Max, we have to get out of here. So they went to the south of France and found this beautiful, idyllic place in a little town called Saint-Martin-d'Ardèche, where they remodeled a house, they painted the doors, they created protective guardians and magical creatures to save the house. And that's where she really learned how to paint. He was her teacher, and then she started writing short stories and books. When the war began, Max was not only German, he was also Jewish. So that was very dangerous for him to be in France at the time, and he was denounced by the neighbors, who thought they were pretty scandalous as a couple, and they took him to a concentration camp in France first. Leonora knew where he was, so she went to the town nearby, she found a bed and breakfast, and she will go every morning to ask the guards if he was okay. And so, in a way, she was taking care of him. She knew where he was, just waiting to try to get him released, which she could do after a few months with the help of some friends. But then they took him a second time. And that second time, she had no idea where he was, whether he was coming back or not, and there were already a lot of rumors about what was happening in the camps. So she had a nervous breakdown. She was with a couple of friends who decided to drive to Spain with her to try to get visas to leave Europe. And she got a psychotic attack on the way there. So they called her family from Spain, and the father decided to have her committed to an asylum in Santander. And that was an experience that she could never forget. She was treated with cardiosol that had the effect of electroshock, and she was locked with a I'm sorry, I forgot the term in English, the straitjacket. And so this is a painting she did after the asylum. She spent there about 6 months. When they finally told her that she could leave, the father sent her nanny and somebody else like a guardian. And what he wanted to do, which was a proper thing for any wealthy British family to do, was to send their children to South Africa during the war, so they wouldn't be called to become soldiers and die at war. So he wanted to send her to South Africa and commit her to another asylum there, and also to separate her from Max. And when she was leaving the asylum with these people, they went to Madrid first, and on their way to Portugal, to Lisbon, where they were going to take the boat to South Africa. And in a restaurant, she runs into a Mexican friend and diplomat, Renato Leduc, that she had met previously in Paris, and asked him to get help to get some visas to get out of Europe. So he gave her a card and said, I'm in Lisbon. So when she arrived there, she escaped the guardians and went to the Mexican embassy looking for Renato. And they then ended up getting married to try to get her out of Europe. So they went together to New York. That was the first trip in her exile. And this is one of the first paintings she did in New York. She was still very impacted by the experience. So this is a self-portrait where she's with the straitjacket inside a magic circle. This is really important because Leonora, through the Surrealist, is going to be very interested in studying all the occult and magical traditions, from witchcraft, Kabbalah, tarot, alchemy, astrology. She studied everything, and she started using magic also in her life. So this act of painting a circle has to do with a ritual act of protection. In magic, to be inside the circle is to be protected, and that's where everything is performed. But she's still in the straitjacket. And it's also the first time that she draws this underworld on the bottom. So that has to do with her experience that she later wrote in a book, her memory, that it's called Down Below, because for her, this time she spent in the asylum was a trip to the underground, for her it was what in Catholicism will be considered the hell, but for her it was more of an underground, like also in the Mayan sculptures, in the Mayan culture, in the Egyptian culture. So this will be a constant in her paintings afterwards. Then in New York, with Renato, you might wonder what happened with Max Ernst, so I should tell you that story first. When she left for Spain, she left him a note in the house in case he will come back. But then she sold the house and gave all the paintings in custody to the owners of a little cafe where they used to have dinner every day. So when Max gets out of the concentration camp, she's gone, and he has no idea where she is. And she was at the camp, and at the asylum, and she didn't know where Max was, whether he was dead or alive. And we know about this because she made multiple drawings in notebooks that just showed up 2 years ago, where she's writing with despair about whether Max is still alive, if something happened to him in the camp. So they had no idea about each other. And Max got married to Peggy Guggenheim for the same reason, to be able to get a passport and leave Europe, at the same time that Leonora was getting married to Renato. And it turns out they jump into each other in the supermarket, in the market in Lisbon, as they were about to flee Europe and go to New York. But Leonora could never forgive him for marrying Peggy, and even though they were friends, for her, after the experience in the asylum, she said she was not the same person. She could never go back to him. And for a long time, it was a mystery why she went to Mexico with Renato. Because Max was in New York, even though they were not lovers anymore, they were very close. André Breton was in New York, Kurt Seligman, Magritte, many of the great Surrealist artists were all there. And that was where things were happening and the people that she knew. And she didn't know anybody in Mexico at all. She had met Remedios Varo once in Paris, but they were not even friends. And it was a mystery that she will abandon New York with a man that she married for convenience, just to get a passport and go to a country that was completely unknown to her. And 2 years ago, when I was curating the exhibition of Leonora Carrington for Mexico, we met Renato Leduc's daughter, and she gave us access to the archive, and there were lots of letters, love letters. So it turns out that Leonora really fell in love with Renato, and that's the reason why she wouldn't let him go back to Mexico without her. So she comes with him, and this is one of the paintings she does, and the title is very significant because Artes 110 was the address of the apartment where they were living when they arrived in Mexico. Now the name of the street has changed. Nowadays it's called Antonio Caso, but at the time it was Artes 110. So this painting is really interesting because that's where she represents herself. It's a self-portrait, and she's leaving Europe, that it's this land that you see the castles that are falling apart because of the war, everything is being destroyed. And she's flying, and she's using her finger as a magic wand to try to activate this wheel that is creating a new dress, a new identity, because she always thought if she was going to be an animal, she will be a horse. And that was for her alter ego. So she's building this new identity sort of as a horsewoman in a new land. She's crossing the ocean to start again. So this is a very symbolic and important painting of this moment in her life. So she arrives to Mexico, and she finds this group of Surrealists in exile. She found Remedios Varo again, who's right next to her, and they became really good friends. At the moment when she gets there, you can imagine, after being in this asylum, that she was very fragile, and she needed to feel contained, she needed to feel love and company, and Renato was never there for her. He had a work at with the diplomatic corps. Then in Mexico, he had a work for the tax office, for Hacienda, but also he loved bars, cantinas, and bullfights, which Leonora hated. She could not stand the cruelty towards the animals. So he was gone all day and all night, and they decided to divorce. And she moved to an old house where Remedios Varo was living with Benjamin Perret. So this is Remedios, Leonora. This is Benjamin Perret, the French Surrealist poet. Ella Wolf, an American. Gunther Gerso, one of his paintings are in the exhibition as well. And this is Jose Horna, a Spanish sculptor. And this is Javier Lizarraga. He was Remedios Varo's first husband. And this is Emerico Weiss. Everybody knows him as Chiki, a Hungarian photographer that became Leonora's husband and the father of her two children. So they were living all together in this same house, and they were practically helping each other to make a living. At the time, they were doing commercial work, except Leonora, was the only one faithful to painting and trying to get somebody to buy the work. But the others, they were doing whatever they could to earn a little bit of money, and the one that got the money will buy dinner. And so it was basically a big family of exiles that were helping each other in a foreign country. And this is one of the paintings she started doing once she was with Chiqui and pregnant of her first children. When she became pregnant, she writes about how her creativity was incredible, and she decided that she wanted to experiment with medieval techniques. So she admired all the Italian masters of the Renaissance. Of course, Jerónimo Bosc was her favorite painting. When he saw the El Jardín de las Delicias at the Prado Museum, the Garden of Delights, she said she couldn't sleep for days just thinking about that painting. So this influence and the motivation of being pregnant as well, she decided that she wanted to start experimenting with painting. And for her, because she also loved the kitchen and cooking, the technique of tempera seemed perfect to suit that need. So she starts doing all these little paintings in the shape of a predella, the paintings that in Italy they go on top of the altar piece. And which this one, what I really like about is that it's a macrocosm of her. In this painting, we can see every subject matter, every interest, every object that will be part of her whole iconography throughout her life. So this is called the house opposite, and we have this house fragmented in pieces, but you cannot distinguish between what's inside and what's outside. So there's the doors open, there's the ocean underneath, you can barely see the water, but then the woods, you have the stars, and you have dark night, and then you have sunshine in there. There she is in the middle, sitting in a circle, in a magic circle again, with a little rocking horse. That was a memory of the one that she had in her childhood and that was later destroyed by her father. There's the woods with these magical creatures, the world of dreams. You have her sitting at the table as the white goddess. That's a figure she's going to use many times to represent herself after she read a book that's called The White Goddess that recovers all the myths from the Celtic times, but also the story of matriarchy in the Mediterranean, all civilizations that were ruled by women and that worship women goddesses. And that's something that she really loved. She said that this book was the most important and influential in her life. It was a true revelation. So the subject of the white goddess is going to be very common. And if you see in the back, there's the shadow of a horse. That's her other identity as her alter ego. And this is Chiqui, her husband, that is bringing this little package with a baby face. She was doing this painting when she found out she was pregnant for the first time. So it's also autobiographical. And then you see the three ladies around the quadron, that it's a metaphorical representation of herself, Remedios Varo, and Kati Horna, the Hungarian photographer that introduced her to Chiqui, because they become really good friends and they call themselves witches. So they are moving the quadron and doing their magic, which is also something that is going to be really important in most of her paintings. Edward James, the British man you probably heard of, he was Leonora's most important mecenas. He inherited a fortune and built a castle in England in a place called West Inn, but also he came to Mexico and he built this surrealist fantasy in the jungle, a place that it's called Gilitla in San Luis Potosí. And he became really good friends with Leonora. He was already a patron of Salvador Dali and Magritte. He had a great collection of Surrealist works. And he started buying from Leonora. This was actually the very first painting that he bought. And he wrote the introduction to her first solo show in New York as well. And he talks about her works as paintings that are being brewed in the cauldron. So he's recognizing her, this magical quality of the work that she will preserve throughout her life. There she is also with Remedios Varo, and we don't know who this guy is, but the picture next to it are all the magical herbs, or the herbs that are used for spells, in a very famous market in Mexico that's called the market of Mercado de Sonora, the market of Sonora, where they used to go. And they didn't only believe in magic or studying magic, they were practicing it. So some of Carrington's paintings, they are spells, and they contain spells within them, and many of the drawings, but they were also practicing magic among them, for instance, to protect against evil's eye, and they loved this part of Mexico because the magical beliefs were still alive in an everyday life. She fell in love with the Day of the Dead. She could not believe how that was celebrated in Mexico and this festivity, but she also found that there were a lot of similarities between the Mexican culture and the Celtic one. And we will see about that in some other slides. But this, for instance, it's called Tiburon, shark, and it's actually a magical spell she dedicates to Remedios Varo because she was feeling sick and she thought somebody was giving her the evil eye. So you will see now in the illustration how she uses local plants, but she also uses international symbols of magic, like the mandragoras. I will point out, no laser now, but I'll try to show you. And she draws her lying in a bed and makes all these drawings trying to protect her. So this kind of drawing, it will be very frequent. She had in Renato Leduc's archive, we found some that were spells to make Renato come back. And it was not because he had abandoned her. She made those in New York. It was because for her, Renato living 6 hours in a row, she was going desperate and she was really worried to be left alone and go crazy again. And that's what she was writing to him in the letters. And started doing the spells, and that later became watercolors or then paintings, and some of them are even inscribed underneath. And then she got more sophisticated. The one before, please.
For some reason, he can't make it go back. I don't know why. Maybe they're working on it.
Okay. So I'll tell you about this while we get to see the images, but she started getting much more sophisticated, and when you look at her library and the books she was reading, then she started studying also magic from Chaldea, from Mesopotamia, and then she was studying the runes and the tarot and using all these different languages and magical spells from every single culture, also from the early Hebraic culture as well. So she started mixing and creating her own language and her own magical spells, and that was part of her paintings throughout her life. So she really believed, like many of the Surrealists, that the art had a magical power and that the artist should go back to the time from, like in prehistory, where the paintings in the caves were intended to be a magical act. So they were painted to invoke and to create this magical effect, drawing the animals they wanted to be able to hunt, etc. So the Surrealists were always trying to go back to this concept of the artist as a magician, of somebody that can perform a magical act. So let me see if the laser works now. Yes. So this is Toloache, which you see here. This is from a codex in Mexico, and it's a plant that is used for love spells. But also here it has the mandragoras. So she's creating her own imagination. Here's her sick friend in bed. And here she writes to Remedios that she make this spell to get rid of evil eye and that get better and come on and have a tequila with me. So, and this is one of the Huichol Indians cutting the peyote, because they were really interested also in the ritual use of plants all over Mexico. So that's something that it's not really obvious when we look at the paintings, but the influence was there. There it goes. So another very important figure related to her is Gerald Gardner. This man, who was an anthropologist in England, he went to study to many, many places based on the previous study of another anthropologist called Margaret Murray, who wrote the introduction for his book. And basically he published this book when the last witches' laws were abolished in England, so he could talk about it. Because at the moment, all the tendency when people spoke about witchcraft was either in a way that was very fantastical and supernatural, or in a way that it was going through the filters of the Catholic Church and the persecution of the witches, and talking about that they were ugly ladies that were having intercourse with the devil and they were killing babies. So there was sort of these tendencies. But what Margaret Murray started doing was to study from the anthropological side what the witches were, the remain of all these healers and wise women that were part of the pagan religions that the Catholic Church tried to eliminate when they came to England at some point. So he publishes this book that was very important because he talks about the study of all the pagan religions that had women goddesses or women in power, or the healers that were really the women that knew how to use these plants and herbs. So when the book was published, it was sent to Mexico, and Leonora read it. And I know about this because I found this letter in Remedios Varo archive addressed to a Mr. Gardner that for many times scholars thought it was just one random name because she, there we go, because she used to make phone letters out of names she found in the phone book. And there was a letter to Mr. Gardner, but the letter was very specific. She was saying that my friend, Mrs. Carrington, read your book to me because I am not fluent in English and I don't speak the language. And we're very interested in magic and witchcraft. And Mr. Carrington and I, with other people, we go to some regions in Mexico where the practice of witchcraft and magic are still going on nowadays. So it was not a coincidence that she was doing that, so I started doing research, and that's when I found that he really existed. And then in the same notebook, there was the address of the Witchcraft Museum where he was a director. So I went on looking to reading his book, and he's also talking about the witchcraft in Mexico and the witch cult and related to the pre-Spanish goddess Tlalzolteotl, which at some point was her cult was transformed into something quite negative by the Catholic priests that came to Mexico, the missionaries. And it turns out that it became the witch with the broom, and that was an evil character, and it was not anymore the goddess of sex and earth and fertility. It turns into be the goddess of filth and dirt. So it was, everything was completely transformed. Here's Leonora at the Artist 110 apartment with her broom next to her. And she always said she used to identify herself with Joan of Arc because she said that in her town, the witches were born, and she could, also be born in the stake because of all her opinions about political, religion. She was an open feminist. And I was telling you how she really found this resonance between the Celtic culture and the Mexican culture. And this painting that it's called Samain, it has to do with the Celtic Day of the Dead. So they also believed that on the 1st of November, which was the Day of the Dead, the spirits could come back to Earth and then have a communication with their beloved ones during only that night, where the veils of the underground and the skies will open, and then they could get together. So that's why she found fascinating in Mexico as well, that they had exactly the same belief that resonated with her childhood stories. And one of the new friends that she also met in Mexico, and that was very influential in everything that she did later on, was Laurette. She was an Italian that married, her name was Lauda, actually, but she married a French who called her Laurette, and she took his last name, so she became Laurette Sejourné. She went to Mexico when she was already divorced, and she married another surrealist, Victor Serge, who was from Russia, and she started studying anthropology and archaeology in Mexico City. And she took Leonora and Remedios Varo in a lot of expeditions to these little towns where they could study what was going on. And Leonora made this is a work, you see both sides, and it's in the middle of crystal, so you can really see. It's a night butterfly, Papillon Nocturne, that she dedicated to her, because it was a sacred the butterfly within the pre-Hispanic culture, and she was studying that subject. There she is, Laurette, when she was studying at UNAM, the University of Mexico. And this is one of her books that has to do with the rituals, the magical rituals, and the healers and witches that she was founding in little towns. And she asked Leonora to illustrate it for her. So the cover is by Leonora, and so it's the survival's reminiscence of a magical world in English. But also, that's the, well, you can see on top, that's one of the chapters where she is writing about this little town in Yautepec in the state of Oaxaca, where they had a very powerful witch man, and they asked him to cast a spell, because every year they have a river, and every year 2 snakes with the tail in the shape of a flower were coming, according to legend, and for that day everything was magical in the town. They will bring good crops, health, all the blessings to the town, but then they will go, and they had dry weather, everything was happening, people, animals were getting sick. So they asked the witch to cast a spell to ask the snakes to stay forever. So he did, and then the snakes just stayed, and that became like a blessed town where everybody wanted to live. So she writes about that, and Leonora illustrated with this figure that has the snake with the flower on the tail. But then this same story inspired a later painting, which is this one, Snake by Floripondio. And she had a great sense of humor, so a lot of her titles sometimes are jokes, sometimes have references that are occult, like she was playing, and sometimes it was just plain sense of